I grew up as I grew up in the late 1900s, 1985 to be exact, and I grew up with parents that grew up much earlier than that. So I was about 15 years behind most trendy clothes, music, anything that was pop culture related. I grew up with a healthy dose of soft rock and 60s and 70s singer-songwriter trivia. So whenever my friends' parents talked about music, I was right there with it. When my friends talked about music, I just tried to smile and nod my head like I knew what I was talking about. I had a lawn business for like 10 years, and it was pretty successful in Montgomery. Never really had to do a lot of advertising, just lots of old ladies, old widows in particular, that told their friends and baked cookies and that kind of thing. Eventually, cookies don't translate to currency, and so I had to get another job. But I always found in my life where there were older people, older influences, older voices that were always a part of my everyday living. Whether it was people that I mowed grass for, or people that I worshiped with, or just generally in school, my core group of friends were usually a year or two older than me. What I've realized now, becoming an older child, is that that's really, really important. And when you don't have that dynamic, when you don't have the wisdom and the experience of someone that's lived life previous to you, always talking to you, even in small ways, chit-chat in the hallways, there's a lot of value to that. We learned that during COVID when it was taken from us for a time. When we don't have multiple generations involved in our lives, we are not living the life that God intended. And what we're seeing now from a statistical standpoint, crisis can come in very quickly, and it can stay and it can fester because we don't have resilience. I think Satan has very cleverly utilized this idea of a generation gap to divide God's people. And he's done it very effectively for a very long time. And so this morning, it may seem odd that even though talking about technology, we're going to talk about generations, but I think it's the perfect place to begin, because where we are today started happening a long time ago. A lot of the trends and a lot of the things that we consider to be contemporary topics have roots decades and even centuries ago. So this first session is going to be heavy on a lot of different data, a lot of information, and we'll get deeper and deeper into the text as we go throughout our day. So here's the first question: how does our relationship with technology impact our relationship with other generations? Well, if you don't know what an 8-track player is, there's a limit to our friendship. The first vehicle that I ever had was a 1976 Datsun B210, yellow with orange and white racing stripes, and yes, absolutely not a chick magnet at all. Had my first date when I was 35 years old. Just kidding. But what I did not date a lot in high school. Maybe it was the car. I had an 8-track player to cassette adapter, which was about yay big, about the slice of a good Sbarro pizza. And the 8-track to cassette adapter, cassette to Walkman, portable Walkman disc player. So again, as you can imagine, I did marry late in life, but that was a way that I learned to drive. I learned to drive by driving a vehicle that was from a very different era. I was really excited when I upgraded to a Chevy Cheyenne, and I had a digital dial. The clock and the radio, because we only listened to a radio back then, were blue numbers, and that was a thrill to me because I no longer had the little orange actual dial that went back and forth to find things. I lived a different experience than most of my friends. Most of them had cars that were relatively young, within about 10 years. My connection to an older generation started with the car. There were a lot of other people that had that car, but none of them went to high school with me. None of them went to high school within about 30 years of me, in fact. So our relationship to different technologies, by default, connects us to different people. Just had a young man share with me a moment ago, I guess it was a triumph or a fail on football last night from a video game. Now you're trying to downplay it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you. All right, so we can play video games and we can record them and then show them to our friends the next day of what happened, right? That was not a thing when I grew up. When I grew up, you had a capital I and a period that went bing, bing, bing. That was entertaining. It was great, and there was a baseball game with the same characters, and I played it as long as I started carpal tunnel early with the thumb, with the joystick. All of these experiences, certain people are laughing and certain people are going, what are you talking about? Already technology has either united or divided us a little bit. So if it has this power to unite and divide, then it's something we're thinking about deeply. My goal this weekend is not to encourage you to take your phone and throw it in the river, and it's not to encourage you to go out and get the latest iPhone. It's to encourage you to do what Christians are to do in every age, and that is to think spiritually about every aspect of your life. The first group we're going to talk about is the silent generation, and the silent generation is currently the largest of the oldest generations. We still have a handful of folks that are a part of the greatest generation that came right before the silence, but on the whole, most of that generation has passed on. So the silent generation, you can see several photos of people there. They got their name from an article in the Time magazine back in the 50s that said, where is this generation? They're silent right now. Why are they not here? Well, you think about the silence. Who came before them? The greatest generation. The greatest generation went through the Depression. They went through multiple world wars. They really kind of became idolized in a lot of ways. They were put on this pedestal. And then who came after the silent generation? Well, that's the boomers. Up to that point, they were the largest generation that we had seen. So sandwiched between them is this silent generation to have this reputation for being sort of silent in the public eye. But if you look at those pictures, I don't think the name aged very well. Some of the things that they're known for are bridging gaps and had marriages early in life, lots of kids. In fact, they married earlier in the 1950s than they did in the 1930s, younger than any generation in the 20th century. The Silents were the youngest generation of the 20th century to get married. Nearly half of new brides in the 1950s were teenagers. That's a weird thing to say out loud, isn't it? The median age of first-time brides was 20 years old. In this post-war baby boom, like in 1957, the birth rate was 3.8 kids per woman. But they didn't grow up in homes with multiple kids. So you have now parents of almost 4 kids that grew up in homes with just maybe one or no siblings at all. That's a big shift in dynamics. Something that they have to navigate that was a different experience from their parents. The divorce rate shot up in the 1960s and 70s. Most divorces were between ages 25 and 49. So the silent generation are the ones that actually started the divorce trend in our country. The boomers took it to a whole nother level, and it's been going up ever since. Some of the contributing factors to the rise in divorce over that time, well, there's a huge rise in individualism in our country. A huge rise in individualism comes from new innovations in the home. The women's movement during that time had more women leaving the home and entering the workforce. Modern appliances that we take for granted that are a part of our lives every day that we don't think twice about until we have to repair or replace them were novel innovations in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that allowed for those who spent their time doing those jobs in the home to now be freed up, to have more time, to seek more education, to seek more employment. We're going to talk about some significant movements during this time, and that's one of them, the women's movement. Remarriage was very common. So what's interesting when you look at the silent generation is that you have a group of people that started to divorce more, but they still believed in marriage. So they didn't believe in just cohabitating and living together without being married. So then you have people like Larry King. You have folks like, who else? Elizabeth Taylor, married 8 different times. Johnny Carson, I think, married 4 or 5 times in his life. These celebrities, these really impactful figures in the public eye, they didn't just live with people, they remarried, to their credit. But they also divorced over and over and over and over again. So think about the way I learned history oftentimes, and maybe it wasn't the way I was taught, but definitely the way that I learned it is sort of linear. This one line with a bunch of maybe other lines and some little dots here and there with a picture of a person with a date and an event. But that's not how history happens. History happens in the sense that it has impact in the form of waves and more like a spider web, right? So you think in terms of how we got to where we are today, it's not just because one thing happened here and now we're here. One thing happened here and it started changing how people think about things. And gradually over time, especially over a rapid period of time when it comes to technology, you start to see a shift in culture, a shift in mentality, in what's right, what's wrong, those kinds of things. So that's how history actually works today. And that's how we have arrived to where we are. These changes in family life are some of the biggest changes that we experience. Silents were twice as likely as those in the greatest generation to believe that the traditional gender roles were not necessarily better. Within 2 generations, opinions had flipped, with most of the greatest generation supporting traditional gender roles and most boomers disagreeing. So the the silent generation, again, stuck between these two really loud, impactful generations. And they ultimately, when we look back, they started to lean more towards the boomers than they did the greatest generation before them. Now, if you think in terms of contemporary topics, we think identity, we think in terms of all kinds of divorce and family dynamics as being very contemporary topics. But when we start to look at the data, it actually goes back decades, if not centuries. There's a book that you may be familiar with, and it's written by a fellow who it gives us a whole picture of, it's called Strange New World. It's a picture of the last 100 years of philosophy and thought in the United States. And in that, he traces, there's a particular fella, and I should have gone back to remind myself of his name, but there's a guy back in like the 1920s that takes the philosophies of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and kind of blends them together. And Marx, of course, says that the government is sort of the end-all, be-all authority. Freud says that sort of sexual identity is the end-all, be-all authority. And he kind of blends them together. And Reich is his name. And he says essentially that when the government is able to define sexual definitions, then that should then be the end-all, be-all authority. And where are we today? This was 100 years ago, this guy is putting forth these philosophies. So again, students that are in school right now, if you have history classes remaining, Bible classes remaining, don't learn just date, time, event. Ask questions like, how does this scale up? What does this lead to? If you're a parent, if you're like me, then the thing that I want to know most every single day is how this interaction with my child is going to scale up 5 to 10 years down the road. Like, how does this... Did I yell at them wrong? Did I raise my voice? Did I do this or that? Could I change that if I knew how it was going to kind of impact in the future? Well, that's the way history actually works. And so we have to kind of open our eyes to that as Christians, and we have to be willing to think in terms of the future and not just here. This particular generation as well has fewer single elderly women today than they did in the 1990s. So advances in healthcare changed life expectancy. Not only that, but they were more educated. This was the first generation to have the majority of their group of people graduate from high school. Think about that. Where we are today in a technology-driven economy started way back in the silent generation because they had to have more education. More education leads to later events in life like marriage and having children. But this didn't start with my people, the millennials. This started way back several decades ago. There was consistent political power among this generation. People like Mitch McConnell, Trent Lott, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, Newt Gingrich, Supreme Court Justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor, Stephen Breyer, and Anthony Kennedy, Antonin Scalia. Some of these names have been in political power for roughly 150 years, it feels like. They've been around a long time. They have had a massive impact on who we are and where we are today. They've had a massive impact on culture, a massive impact on legislation. This is indeed not a silent generation. Generally speaking, they are known as more conservative compared to other generations when you look back on it. We'll move into the boomer generation. One thing about technology that is guaranteed is that when you really need it to work, it's probably going to mess with you just to keep you on your toes. And that's where I find myself this morning with a frozen screen of an iPad. So we'll kind of walk through this if we can. So with the boomer generation, they, of course, came after the silence, born between 1946 and 1964. And for years, they were the largest generation we had in our population. In 2021, they were 21.1% of the population here in the United States. There was a growing comfort with drug use during that time. And there was also a big emphasis on self-focus. If you go back and look at the Google Book database, which is an online database, you can see the usage of words used over different periods of time. During the 60s and particularly in the 70s, you see the self-help genre kind of coming into focus. It becomes a prominent genre in American literature that didn't exist prior to that time. In the 60s, you had an emphasis on the communal experience. It was all about us and we. The 70s and into the 80s, you start to see pronouns like I and me, the singular pronouns that occur with greater usage. Again, this emphasis on identity. In worship in particular, we're going to talk a lot about identity. We're going to talk a lot about community and purpose. These are questions that every generation has sought answers to. This particular generation started having fewer children and started having more divorce. which is, again, another shift in not just dynamics, but also in how they go about family, the definition of family, the purpose of family. It changes your structure. It changes how you do different events, right? The experience you have growing up directly impacts the experience that you create when you're older and when you're an adult. Another thing that stands out to me here is that a nationwide survey that was taken in 1967 reported that 85% of U.S. adults said premarital sex was wrong in 1967. In 1979, we're talking 12 years later, that number went from 85% to 37%. Again, a generational shift in a very short period of time. Attitudes towards sexuality, attitudes towards relationship, attitudes towards family. These are places we can go to see how things have shifted and changed. Now, I'm one that's kind of conflicted because I grew up really believing Solomon, saying that nothing new under the sun. I think that the overall sins of today are the same overall sins that we saw in the 60s, overall sins that we saw even in the first century. That's why the Bible is relevant to us today. Sexual sin is still a struggle. Truth is still a struggle. However, the packaging of these things and the way we experience, and particularly emerging generations, the way they are exposed to different temptations today is vastly different than just 10, 15, and 20 years ago. This particular generation pioneered that everything was okay to talk about out in the open. You think back to Oprah Winfrey and the success of her show. That's one of the things she did really well. She talked about anything. This is whenever I have friends of mine that say that today, or the millennials, there was a little span of time, about 5 or 10 years, where it was the millennials' fault for everything. And I disagree. The very first president we had that tried to change the definition of the word is was a boomer. So it's all the boomers' fault, and I'll present my case to you for that today as well. But the world changed with the rise and ebb and flow of the boomers. When they were children in the 50s and early 60s, our country was very family and child focused. You think back of the TV shows that were very popular then with Andy Griffith and others. When they were rebellious teens, the nation was roiled by social change in the 1960s. When they were young adults, culture experienced a fascination with the mystical there in the 70s. And again, drug use went to a next level there. And as they were building their careers in the 1980s and 1990s, our economy was booming. It was humming along. And now that they're in the retirement years of life, there's been an influence on that as well with regards to boomers having some of the largest amount of retirement wealth of any generation our country has ever known. So it's interesting to kind of see the timeline over the last 100 years or so and how each generation ebbs and flows and fits into that timeline. The words unique and identity surged in use in American books after 1960, in particular, the word identity. This may be the greatest topic of our day today, but it is not a new topic of our day. It's been around for a very long time. And yet, Satan still manages to say, well, okay, boomer, you stay over there. I'm Gen Z, Gen Alpha, whatever we're going to end up calling them. I'm millennial, I'll stay over here. We're not the same, but we are. We are the same in some very deep, necessary ways, and we need the voice of each in our lives. Older people need younger people to get their phone out of Portuguese when they accidentally press a bunch of buttons. Young people need older people to help them navigate, to say, hey, you know what? I struggled with relationships as well. I struggled with friends that were honest and that I could talk to about anything. I struggled with dating relationships. I struggled with job, this or that. We have so much more in common than Satan would like for us to think. And so when we allow the age gap to divide us, then we're allowing Satan to win. Move on to Gen X. Gen X was a smaller generation, and again, another one of those generations that were sandwiched between the two largest. They were between the boomers and the millennials. So two really loud, boisterous generations. Nestled in between there is Gen X. Gen X was born between 1965 and 1979. And wherever you go to do genealogy studies, you'll have different dates for each generation. These are taken from Jean Twengey's book, Generations. It's an excellent resource. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to dig into that. These are the dates that she chooses, and she doesn't base generations solely off of world events like a lot of people do. She factors in technological advancements to kind of set those parameters. They were the first analog and digital communicators. They were the first ones on the internet, but they weren't the first ones raised on the internet. They were largely responsible for the internet that we have today. YouTube was started by 3 Gen Xers. The first web browser, Netscape, was written by a Gen Xer in 1993. eBay, PayPal, MySpace, Twitter, Uber, Napster, all of these startups in the dot-com boom in the late 80s, early 90s, those are Gen Xers that were at the forefront of those. Something else interesting is that they were the last generation to go through high school without the internet. And think about that for a moment. How different of an experience is it to go through high school with the internet accessible? When I was in high school, it was becoming necessary. They had introduced the Alabama Virtual Library, and we had our own little cards and all this stuff. We weren't going to the main library nearly as often, and that happened very, very quickly. So this is the first generation to have a completely unique experience from generations before them. As they were getting out of high school, things were changing into a more digital world. Very much a TV generation, loved to share pop culture. They shared pop culture experiences because they watched them together. Everybody watched the same Saturday morning cartoons Saturday morning. Everybody had the same commercial break to go to the bathroom, to get a snack, and to be back before the show came back on, right? They grew up hearing the word telephone when the phone rang, and you didn't want to answer it, but you wanted somebody else to get to it. They're the last generation to get the reference of the 300-foot squiggly cord that was actually on the yellow phone in the kitchen, but it reached to every room in the house if it needed to, right? So they have this, but they also know what YouTube is, and they've been using it for years. So there's this digital and analog experience that are core to their developmental years and their late adolescence. That's a big separator when it comes to looking at different generations. TV shows like Brady Bunch was on syndication. They started learning the facts of life from watching the facts of life. Divorce went to an all-new level with the boomer generation, and Gen Xers were the ones that caught the brunt of that impact. As divorce rates soared, people like Dr. Huxtable became surrogate fathers through television. If you think back to television shows that had prominent father figures during the 80s and 90s, that's one of the reasons why. There were nearly 3 times as many children in the 1980s were living with the divorced mom or dad than had in the 1960s. So in a 20-year leap, 3 times as many people grew up with a divorced home life. Divorced families became the norm during that time. There's also, we see the rise and the fall of the latchkey kid. You remember the term latchkey kid? This is before after-school programs became prominent. Students would get home and no one was there because both parents were now working in the workforce full-time. And so there was a key left in the latch somewhere, or left under the rug, or left in the rocker in the plant, and they would be at home for 2 or 3 hours by themselves. And you may think that's not a big deal, but unchaperoned, unsupervised alone time turns out is actually really important. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Anxious Generation, recommends that as one of the 4 new norms that we have here. Children in particular, not just latchkey kids in middle school, high school, but young children need some time where they can sort out right and wrong, where they can sort out relationship dynamics without a mom and a dad hovering over them. We used to call them helicopter parents. Now they're drone parents, right? Where they're constantly looking over the shoulder, critiquing and doing life for them, as opposed to teaching them how to do life and doing life with them. There are things that happen with technology that make life more convenient, more comfortable. And oftentimes it's not until years down the road we look back and say, actually, the value wasn't as high as I thought. This is one of those that was built in. Eventually, schools started to notice a need for this, and they started offering after-school programs. Boomers and Gen Xers were raised in this fast life strategy era. Most needed to work sooner than millennials and Gen Xers. So they had a shortened childhood compared to generations before them, and a longer adolescence period. Gen X married later than any generation in American history. Boomers married, on average, at the age of 20 for women and 23 for men. By the time we get to the Gen X generation, they married at 25 and 27. We see those numbers climbing today. Today, the median average age for women to first get married has risen to 28 years. This was back in 2023. While for men, the figure is 30 years. So in the span of just 2 generations, we aged about a decade in average age of marriage. I used to work with a preacher. He retired a few years ago. He got married, I think, at like 7 or 8, somewhere in there, the way he talked about it. I think it was actually 17 or 18. I did not. I got to Madison, and I was a youth and family minister without a family for a while. And he would ask questions like, when are you going to get married? Like, well, is that how you do it? It's like, is there a vending machine that I just don't know about? Like, okay, here we go. We had some frustration. Well, I had frustration. I think he just laughed a lot at me. But there was a sense of like, I'm trying, man. I'm sorry. Like, the hairline's receding. I can't stop it. Like, there's a sense of urgency here too, all right? But when you think about it, someone that got married at 16 and somebody that married at 26, my wife didn't sign my report cards like his did, right? That was my one comeback. That was about it. When you get married in your late 20s, you already have a house, oftentimes. You already have a job, oftentimes. You've already made some big boy and big girl decisions, oftentimes. Now, sharing life together, it's a different challenge because you have to put aside who you've already started to become to now become one with this other person. That's a huge shift from coming right out of high school into marriage when you're both still children in a lot of ways. There are so many ways that our life experiences are different. That is not a bad thing. And we cannot allow it to be a bad thing. We cannot allow it to be something that divides us. It must be something that unites us, something that helps us to see life deeper on a spiritual level. I saw this stat as well. There was a lower age for their first sexual experience and a higher age for the first marriage among Gen Xers. Having children was no longer tied to marriage. And this wasn't new and novel for Gen X. In 1964, we had a technological advancement in the birth control pill that came about, which led the way for the late 60s and the sexual revolution of the late 60s into the early 70s. So this mentality, again, is tied directly to technology. A key generational shift. Only 11% of women ages 19 to 44, boomers in silence, had lived with an unmarried partner before their first marriage. By 2010 through 2013, so this is Gen X and millennials, that number grew from 11% to 69%. Again, massive change in experience, massive change in ideology. Divorce rates fell after the 1980s, which means that this generation later generally means they stayed married longer if they married later in life. College-educated couples who married in the mid-1990s were 27% less likely to divorce in their first 10 years than those marrying in the 1970s. There's also a rise in self-esteem and a focus on self. Again, the word self-esteem skyrocketed from 1970 and 1995 if you look at the Google word database. Boomers discovered self in the context of groups, protests, festivals, things like that, world events. But Xers did not. Gen Xers were becoming more individualistic in their adolescent experience. They were more confident and positive than their boomers were before them. There was an emphasis on materialism, caviar dreams. Remember the lifestyle of the rich and famous. There was an emphasis on excess. And you go back and look at the different TV shows that were popular during that time. You look at the shift in the content of music during that time. And it starts to grow more towards a materialism approach. There was a growing divide between the rich and the poor with the decline of manufacturing. A college degree became not just a good thing to have, but a necessity to have. They were tough and they were cynical. And there was a delayed leadership that came about during Gen Xers. Now my people, the millennials, I would say the best among us, but that's for another time. We are relentlessly self-confident, oftentimes without cause. The 9/11 housing bubble, the dot-com boom of the early 2000s were two of the major crises that we grew up in the midst of, trying to make sense of the world. Every generation has at least one of those. After 2000, the first singular pronouns began to take off in literature, and here's the kicker, the change here was that collective pronouns became much less common. There was a huge decrease there. Students spent less time doing homework, yet they were making better grades. We see actual documented grade inflation during the millennials. So there becomes this self-confidence that is built without resilience. Self-confidence without resilience and without adversity and without struggle will eventually crumble in a very spectacular form. And I think where we are today, some of the research that Height has shown us, particularly in Gen Z with anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts, I think it really began to take root in the millennials because there wasn't the struggle in a young childhood. Things like just physical play, analog play. When you go, everything goes to a video game, that's not a real struggle. I mean, it can be, but it's not. But once you beat Zelda once, you realize, no, it's not a struggle. Like, we can conquer the world here. But what happens when you don't do physically difficult things, you don't know that you can do physically or emotionally difficult things. We have this mentality, and Haidt says it happened around the late 80s, early 90s, where parents fed into what now we believe is a lie, that things are not safe outside, so the kids must come inside. And they came inside and they connected to an online world, and it turns out the online world was at least as dangerous, if not more so, than the outside world. And so that's how we got to where we are today. When you don't do difficult things, you don't realize that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's a real thing. That's in the Bible. That's a biblical concept, which also means that I'm expected to do difficult things. God's people are the ones that should manage crisis better than anybody because we know that we can do all things, that we have a Savior that walks with us and guides us. There's this sense of entitlement that you start to see among the millennial generation. We may have the best music and the best creativity, but we struggle with some things as well. We're a little entitled. We think we have the best music and the best things. Because we did. All right. The power of the microphone is you have no rebuttal. I just keep on going. It's great. There was this narcissism that really started to take root in the 90s and the 2000s, in particular in the university setting. This generation were the first true digital natives, where a lot of them, especially younger millennials, spent the majority of their childhood online in some form. When you think about it this way, I have a friend who's he's probably mid to late 50s. We were talking one day about some of the stuff, and he said, we spent every Saturday and every quarter that we could save during the week at the arcade. And that was our hangout spot. That's where we stayed. We played pinball for hours. We played whatever games we could. I said, that's interesting. The arcade came home when I was growing up. I still played games. I still played with my friends on those games, but it was in our living room and not at an arcade, which means there was less interaction with other people, which means when you go to the arcade, there's a finite number of quarters and tokens that you have. But at home, thanks to the Sega channel in the mid-1900s, you could play it all day long. And now we have streaming. Some of the natural stopgaps of the parts of our lives that were common among generations, when you don't have a stopgap, it makes it a very different experience. We're going to say this a lot too. Access to excess does not cultivate holiness. Are you more disciplined or less disciplined at the buffet? Okay, I am less disciplined at the buffet. I'll make you feel bad. I consider the salad bar to be wasted real estate. That needs to be either chocolate, ice cream, or red meat. Those are the options. I like the greenery, it's cute, but we don't need it because if I'm going there, I want to eat as much steak as possible because every bite of steak increases the value of the $14 to $25 I paid for a buffet, right? We feel like we got to have more because we paid for unlimited access. Well, that's not really the life that Jesus calls us for. He doesn't say that there's access to excess is going to give you deep, meaningful joy. In fact, he says it's just the opposite. Analog methods of entertainment and music and TV gave way to streaming. You think of this is the rise of Napster and coincidentally the fall of Metallica. In 2004, thefacebook.com was introduced. Back in the good old days, you had to have a .edu email address to get access to that. I was a holdout for about 2 weeks on Faulkner's campus, and I finally gave in because I got tired of walking past the computer lab and everybody, this is when we had the computers like in the desk for some reason, terrible for all of this, but everybody was doing this, looking down. And I mean, you went from 3 people in the computer lab to not ever finding a computer available in a matter of about 2 or 3 weeks because it was this great new thing that you could connect with people you hadn't seen in years. It was like an online yearbook. And I thought of that for a while until I witnessed 2 friends of mine go through a divorce via their Facebook status and taking not so veiled shots at each other. That was back in the day where it said Jason is feeling and then you filled in the blank. Well, they would go back and forth having these just terrible, terrible comments. Everybody knew exactly who they were talking about. We had to learn along the way, just like I need to learn to talk faster. They're high earners. By 2019, household incomes are actually higher among millennials than they are previous generations. And people tend to forget that. We forget that. We tend to play the woe is me poverty card, but it's just not there. Gen Z have significantly less information about Gen Z because we're still learning. But ultimately, what we know right now is that they're huge. There are a huge number of them. 23% of the population in 2020. There's an emphasis on gender fluidity. There's an emphasis on a rise in the LGBTQ community. There's interest in physical and emotional safety. They're growing up very slowly. Their experiences today as 16 and 17-year-olds are the experiences that previous generations had at 10. There's a decline in the necessity of getting a driver's license. They're waiting until 17, 18, or never to get a license. For me, that was the symbol of freedom. My parents taking away the car keys is the same today as you taking away your device from your child. It's your connection to your friends. It's your connection to the outside world. I lived about 14 feet from the grocery store. When I turned 16, you better believe I said, Mom, we need bread, milk. She's like, no, we're good. Like, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you, I need to go to the grocery store because I can drive. Driving down, in fact, I live on a hill. If you tripped at just the right spot, you would roll into the grocery store. To drive is a complete, it's not a good thing to do. It's a waste of gas. But when I was 16, it was freedom. Coasting in neutral down into the parking lot in that car was the same thing as driving across the border to Canada or Mexico at that point. I could go anywhere. What my parents knew that I didn't was 1976 Datsun B210. You ain't going anywhere. But anyway, you see the faces of folks that are part of this generation that are highly influential right now, racially conscious, dissatisfied, depressed, and pessimistic. However, I've also found them to be extremely optimistic, extremely creative, extremely energetic for change and connection. What kind of connection? Most of all, I think, is they want mentors in their life. They've grown up with a very digital experience, and they want analog experiences. They want to know how to do stuff. They want to know how to make artisan coffee. They want to know how to carve wood. They want to know how to build things. And they're really, really smart. If we see them as these cast-offs, as a generation that's a product of their raising, then all we're criticizing is us, the adults in the room. I'm not trying to cast blame anywhere. I'm simply trying to say we all have a hand in this, which means we all have a hand in making things right and improving where we are today. Alpha generation, this would be my kids. We don't know yet. That's one name given to them. They're still growing. I'm a little bit terrified, but I'm also really excited to see what my kids can do with this next chapter. The four major revolutions, I've referenced a couple of those. Tech revolution, the sexual revolution, the women's movement, and the youth movement. Two that I want to focus on this morning is the tech revolution. Manufacturing economy now has shifted into a knowledge-based economy. Manufacturing is 6 times the amount that it was in 1950. Think about that. 6 times the amount of manufacturing. However, it uses half of the amount of people in the workforce. That's a big change. The millennials in particular were promised this job market that just didn't exist by the time they got to the market, because the market had changed on them. The landscape had changed without them realizing it. There's a need for an extended education. More people get more education for longer, which pushes family life later. They get married later, they have children later. It takes longer to prepare for a knowledge economy than it did for a manufacturing economy. How many of your grandparents and great-grandparents were in the workforce at the age of 17 or 18 years old? What percentage of soldiers in World War II didn't make it to 20? There are a couple of comedians that have really kind of honed in on that. Imagine if today's 17 and 18-year-olds, with all due respect to any 17, 18-year-olds, were the ones that were in the front lines fighting the war for us that we had to depend on. There were some Frappuccino references in that joke, I think, but I'll move on from it. The birth control pill that I referenced, mentioned in 1964, broke the link between sexuality, reproduction, and marriage. They were no longer tied intimately together. We removed the seemingly greatest consequence of a sexual experience with someone. When you remove that consequence, this is where we end up. Changed attitudes, changed approaches, broken families. Most people today begin being sexually active 10 years or more before marriage, a longer period where kids are making and breaking relationships. What does a generation of work smarter, not harder look like? Well, we preach that a lot, and then we walked into the digital age where kids today can automate almost every aspect of their life. Siri and Alexa do so many things for us, which in and of themselves, not a bad thing, but when it scales up, when we no longer can do hard things because we've never had to do hard things, then we're in a bad place. Technology can be our friend, it can be a help. But when we allow it, it also shapes us. The reason we start here is 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul talks to a church that's having trouble connecting with one another, having trouble seeing value in the eyes of the other people. And so he speaks very frankly and very directly to the church at Corinth. Turn with me there, or swipe, if you will, to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And we'll end with a couple passages here. For just as the body is one and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so too is Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks or slaves or free, millennial, Gen X, silent, boomer. We were all made to drink of the one Spirit. For in fact the body is not a single member but many. If the foot says, since I am not a hand, I am not part of the body, it does not lose its membership in the body because of that. And if the ear says, since I am not an eye, I am not part of the body, it does not lose its membership in the body because of that. If the whole body were an eye, well then, what part would do the hearing? If the whole were an ear, what part would exercise the sense of smell? But as a matter of fact, God has placed each of the members in the body just as he decided. If they were all the same member, where would the body be? We are all part of the body of Christ. No matter our ethnicity, our complexion, our hairline, our beard line, for those of you that can't grow beards in your face, for those that are young, 8, 9, and 10 years old, you have a place in this place, and not the physical building. For those that are 80 and 90 years old, you have a place, not just in this physical building, but in the body of God. In his church, in his kingdom, we all have a place. He's preparing a room for all of us. So why do we allow Satan to section us off? Why do we allow Satan to control the perspective when we look in the eyes of someone else? Young people, oh man, I always said I would never say young people. Emerging generations, when those that are younger, I'm in this weird middle age where young people think I'm old people think I'm young. I have back pain, so I guess I'm old. When you look in the eyes of someone that doesn't look like you, because they have more wrinkles on your face than you do, number one, be careful, your wrinkles are coming. Number two, those are signs of wisdom and experience. Be curious. Be curious and ask questions. How did you grow up? This is not just a Ted Lasso reference. Be curious, not judgmental. That's actually pretty good advice. Ask them about their experience growing up when they were your age. What were their struggles? What was it like? What did they listen to? Go back and listen to that music. I don't think you're going to find the substance to be all that different. For those of you that are older and you look and you see the vitality of those that are younger than you, don't dismiss that. Don't begrudge that. Give them meaningful work to do. The work that you can oversee and that you can speak wisdom into their lives and have a shared experience together. In Romans 3:23, it tells us that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Why do we start here? Because we all fall short, no matter our age, no matter our experience. We all are shaped by technology. This is not a young person's workshop. This is not a parents of young people workshop. This is a spiritual workshop for all generations. And we start here so that everybody in the room sees that you've been impacted by technology and you also impact each other. As a parent, I need all of you in the lives of my children. Those of you that are just a little bit older, that are teenagers, I need you to show my kids how to steward technology well. Those of you that are parents, I need you to show me how to steward our children, the lives of our children, well. Those of you that are grandparents, I need your wisdom. I need your companionship. I also need your accountability. When life is going too fast, I need somebody to say, hey man, pump the brakes. I know that you're chasing these things, but I'm telling you the value is over here, not where you're going. The Apostle Paul confronted Peter because Peter was undermining everything the gospel stood for. At Antioch, of all places, one of the most beautiful examples of a multi-ethnic, multi-generational congregation of God's people, Peter decided to have some favorites and felt uncomfortable. We need accountability, and we need encouragement, and we need each other. If you haven't already, this is a survey. We'll share some of the results of this afternoon, so if you haven't taken it, feel free to go ahead and do that. I am truly excited to be with you guys this weekend. This has become one of my most passionate topics to talk about technology and faith, and part of it is because I don't think we've done a great job of that in the church. The afternoon session in particular is going to talk about how technology has shaped our view of sexuality, and if there is one conversation that I don't think that we've had enough, and it's conversations about sexuality. And oftentimes when we did have those conversations, sometimes we don't do it well, and both matter. frequency as well as how we approach these topics. So if you don't mind contributing, it's an anonymous survey. I would be very grateful to add that to the research to present to you this afternoon. But again, I'm grateful that you're here. I hope you'll stick around. We'll close with prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for the opportunity to gather in your name this morning, to come and to glean from the picture of where we have gotten to today. Thank you for the research that has been shown to us in recent years for us to have a better, more accurate picture of the life that has been created around us, Father. We are your people living in this digital Babylon age. Help us to see spiritually so that we can shine a light as you would have us to live. Help us to not pursue the stuff of this world, but to pursue you and to become more like Christ every day. Thank you again for allowing us to gather this morning. In Christ's name, amen.